What if the fiercest fight is not on distant battlefields, but inside your own home, woven into your morning routine, your city streets, the fragile rhythm of daily life? Imagine waking to news that towns in the Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk regions, once thought safe, have changed hands overnight. The front line, once a concept whispered about in far-off headlines or military briefings, has crept closer, bringing new destruction and uncertainty. Suddenly, your sense of security dissolves, replaced by the uneasy knowledge that the conflict is now at your doorstep. Within a single week, Ukrainian forces have lost between 10,000 and 11,000 soldiers. Even if figures are disputed, the reality is clear. The toll keeps climbing, and with it, a growing sense of dread. Throughout history, wars have often been defined by casualty numbers. Think of the Somme in World War I, or Stalingrad in World War II. But rarely have such losses been so deeply felt so quickly by the entire fabric of a society. The shortages are not just in ammunition, but in people, vehicles, and the very tools needed for survival. These shortages echo those seen in France during the final months of World War I, when supplies ran so low that soldiers had to improvise weapons and civilians lined up for hours for a loaf of bread. Each day, the warnings grow sharper. There are simply not enough reinforcements, and supplies are dwindling at a dangerous pace. The word echoing everywhere is exhaustion. Morale is shaken as the pressure mounts, not only at the front, but in homes and hearts across the country. In every small town and city block, families whisper about the latest losses and worry about what might come next. This war is no longer confined to trenches far from view. It is spilling into the core of society, snapping power lines, stopping trains, dimming city lights, and forcing families to prepare for the worst. In Kyiv, residents now keep emergency go-bags by their doors, a practice unseen since the darkest days of the Second World War. Now, the battleground is infrastructure, spirit, and routine itself. The stakes are higher than ever. What part of normal life will collapse next? Let us reveal how a modern war front can suddenly invade your living room, and what that means for the millions still living in its shadow. Consider the case of Mariupol in the early days of the conflict, where families were forced to cook meals over open fires in apartment courtyards when gas lines were severed. Or look at the more recent example of Kharkiv, where repeated air raids have turned once busy neighborhoods into zones of eerie silence, punctuated only by the distant thud of artillery. To understand how this happened so quickly, we need to look at Russia's new strategy and why it is forcing Ukraine to fight on multiple unexpected fronts. Imagine a chess game where the pieces never stay in their squares, and every new move opens up a dozen new threats. The traditional logic of front lines and safe zones no longer applies. When the front line is everywhere, what keeps a country running? This is the question haunting not just generals and politicians, but every ordinary Ukrainian. In Ukraine today, war is no longer just soldiers exchanging fire in distant trenches. The conflict now sprawls across entire systems, energy grids, railways, warehouses, and into the everyday lives of millions. Each new wave of Russian strikes aims to do more than destroy. The goal is to cripple the machinery that lets Ukraine fight, endure, and survive. Systematic attacks slam into energy infrastructure, plunging vast regions into sudden blackouts. Entire cities are left without power for hours, sometimes stretching into days. For families, that means darkness at home, cold apartments, food spoiling in powerless refrigerators, and no way to charge a phone or call for help. Think of the London Blitz during World War II, when blackouts became the norm and families had to adapt to nights spent in underground shelters, listening for the telltale whistle of falling bombs. Industry grinds to a halt. Factories lose power and stop production. Trains freeze on the tracks, buses and trams are stranded in depots, and stores must rely on backup generators that cannot last forever. Food supply chains break down, hospitals struggle to keep the lights on, and the fragile web that connects daily life starts to unravel. In Odesa, for instance, several bakeries recently closed because their ovens could not run without electricity, forcing locals to wait in long lines for bread deliveries from neighboring towns. But the campaign stretches beyond electricity. Russian strikes now aim for the arteries of Ukraine's war effort: logistics, supply lines, and the hubs where soldiers are trained and equipped. In recent days, missile and drone attacks have demolished not just military stockpiles, but also crucial training centers and logistics bases. These are reminiscent of the German blitzkrieg tactics of World War II, where striking deep into enemy supply lines was key to collapsing resistance. One drone strike destroyed a full convoy of trucks loaded with weapons and supplies. Another hit a warehouse where new drone operators were being trained, killing both instructors and trainees and destroying the equipment they needed to learn. Ammunition depots erupt in fireballs, shockwaves shattering windows miles away. Even ambulances and vehicles meant to bring aid or evacuate the wounded now risk becoming targets. This is total war, where nothing and no one is truly safe. This systematic destruction goes far beyond the armed forces. When the power fails, when transport and communication networks collapse, civilians find themselves on the front line too, risking not just comfort, but survival itself. Suddenly, war is no longer distant. It is the empty shelves in supermarkets, the flickering lights in hospital corridors, and the silence that follows when the last radio dies. During the siege of Leningrad in World War II, similar scenes played out as families rationed what little they had, and hope became as scarce as bread. None of this is accidental. It is a deliberate shift, a signal that the war is now a battle for the very ability to function as a nation. As blackouts deepen and supply lines fray, one question shadows every hour. What happens next, and why has the battlefield changed so completely now? It is a strategy designed not just to conquer territory, but to erode the will and ability to resist. As systematic strikes grind on, their impact stretches well beyond the front, testing not only Ukraine's military, but the resilience of its entire society. Meanwhile, Western military aid faces new pressures, and uncertainty grows over how much longer Ukraine can hold out. In past conflicts, such as the Korean War, the loss of key logistical hubs often signaled the beginning of the end. Here, the future remains uncertain, but the warning signs are unmistakable. Imagine a war where the greatest threat is not a sudden enemy assault, but the slow, relentless fading of your own country's vital systems, one blackout after another. This is the new reality in Ukraine. Under Andrei Belousov, Russia's new defense minister, the strategy has shifted. The era of scattered missile barrages is over. Now, every strike is deliberate. Energy grids, supply hubs, railway junctions, and even training camps are methodically targeted. This is not symbolic destruction, but calculated warfare meant to break Ukraine's backbone. Each hit sends shockwaves far beyond the front. With every lost warehouse or severed railway, the flow of ammunition and supplies to Ukrainian forces thins. Soldiers report dwindling stockpiles. Fresh equipment is scarce. Fatigue mounts as battered units face unceasing waves of attack, cut off from relief. The risk to morale is growing as hope for reinforcements fades. This echoes the experience of the Soviet Union during the early years of Operation Barbarossa, when supply shortages and relentless pressure pushed defenders to the brink. But this campaign is not confined to the battlefield. The war is seeping into daily civilian life. Rolling blackouts now plague dozens of towns. Some neighborhoods spend half a day or more in darkness. Factories go silent. Trains stand frozen on their tracks. Shops depend on backup generators, which too often fail. Fuel shortages strand buses and cars, forcing people to walk for miles between villages. The distinction between the front line and the home front is vanishing. In the small town of Trostianets, for example, the local hospital had to evacuate all patients after backup power ran out during a cold snap. Inside government offices, tension is thick. Sources say Ukrainian leaders are increasingly worried. Reserves are nearly gone. Behind closed doors, some even consider negotiating a brief ceasefire, desperate for time to regroup. The existential question hangs heavy. As the lifelines that sustain both army and civilians are cut down, how much longer can resistance endure? Similar questions haunted Churchill's cabinet in the darkest days of the London Blitz. Then, as now, the answer was unclear. These setbacks are not isolated. They are part of a systematic plan to collapse Ukraine's capacity to fight and function. Every darkened street, every missed shipment, every empty tank inches the nation closer to a breaking point. The lessons of history, whether from the sieges of Sarajevo, Aleppo, or Grozny, show that when civilian infrastructure collapses, the social fabric can unravel in weeks, not months. Yet as Ukraine reels under these cascading blows, Western aid is faltering, and the path forward is clouded by uncertain alliances and deepening civilian hardship. Think of the Berlin airlift of 1948, when Western allies raced to supply a besieged city. Today, the logistical challenges are even greater, and the enemy more determined to sever every possible supply route. As international support wavers, Ukraine stands at a crossroads. Fight on, freeze the front, or gamble everything at the negotiating table. None of these paths come without steep risks, and the burden now weighs not just on soldiers, but on millions of civilians whose daily routines are crumbling under the stress of war. Picture a grandmother in Zaporizhzhia, forced to choose between spending her last hryvnias on candles or medicine for her grandson. Whispers of a possible summit between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump circulate, with Budapest floated as neutral ground. The world's gaze sharpens, hoping for any sign that diplomacy might break the deadlock. Yet peace talks remain frustratingly out of reach, and each passing day deepens the sense of exhaustion on all sides. This diplomatic limbo echoes the drawn-out negotiations of the Paris peace accords in the Vietnam War, which dragged on for years as the human cost mounted. Western military aid has slowed to a near halt. Washington's refusals to send new air defense systems or Tomahawk missiles mark a chilling shift. Kiev's commanders must stretch dwindling stockpiles and patch outdated equipment, even as Russian missiles batter energy grids and dismantle vital infrastructure piece by piece. In World War II, the Lend-Lease program kept Britain afloat. Today, Ukraine's lifeline is fraying. European capitals are divided. Political fractures widen as some governments hesitate, wary of deeper involvement or escalation. With the United States distracted by election year politics, its influence over Ukraine's war effort wanes, leaving Kiev more isolated than ever, forced to improvise with fewer allies and vanishing guarantees. In Berlin, Paris, and Rome, leaders debate behind closed doors, balancing moral obligation against political risk. For ordinary Ukrainians, the impacts are immediate and relentless. Water taps run dry, heating fails, and public transport falters, especially as cold weather sets in. Humanitarian groups warn that millions may soon lack access to basic necessities. The war is no longer distant. It now invades kitchens, schools, and crowded city streets. In one Kiev district, teachers have begun holding classes in windowless basements, using battery-powered lamps. Inside Ukraine, frustration mounts. Military and civilian voices alike demand accountability and rapid adaptation, calling for smarter logistics and transparent leadership. But with resources near breaking and exhaustion spreading, solutions seem painfully out of reach. A recent poll found that nearly half of Ukrainians now believe the war could last several more years, a grim testament to the depth of their fatigue. What hangs in the balance is not merely land, but the survival of a nation's way of life. Will this war freeze into a bitter stalemate, reignite into fresh violence, or spiral into chaos as systems collapse and hope flickers? The answer may depend on decisions made in the coming weeks, and on the ability of communities to hold together under unprecedented strain. When the support structure itself trembles and options dwindle, what choices are left for those on the ground and for anyone watching from afar? History is full of moments when ordinary people had to decide whether to flee, stay, or resist. In Warsaw in 1944, in Beirut during the Civil War, and now in Ukraine, such choices are never easy and always consequential. The coming weeks will test not only Ukraine's resolve, but the world's willingness to stand behind it. As the stakes rise, every decision, military, diplomatic, or humanitarian, carries consequences that reach far beyond the battlefield. In an interconnected world, the shockwaves of conflict can ripple outward, reshaping economies, alliances, and lives across continents. If you cannot predict the next front line, how do you stay alive? This question is not just for soldiers or politicians, but for every citizen. Modern war has evolved. It is no longer confined to soldiers clashing on distant fields. Now, entire societies are swept into the conflict. Power grids, railway lines, even the ordinary routines of civilians. These are all targets, chosen to unravel daily life. Every blackout, every stalled train, and every empty shelf becomes a new front line. For civilians, preparation is no longer optional. Readiness means more than comfort. It is survival. Stockpiling generators, securing backup fuel, and practicing emergency drills are now vital habits. You may find yourself lighting candles, hauling water from far-off wells, or sharing the last cans with neighbors as supply chains break down. In the Donbass region, some have formed neighborhood committees to share resources and coordinate emergency responses, echoing the civil defense groups of wartime London. True resilience is measured by a community's ability to absorb shock, not just by military force. Redundant systems, spare power, local food reserves, decentralized logistics, spell the difference between chaos and continuity. Flexible plans and strong neighborhood bonds matter as much as anything at the front. In Lviv, some apartment blocks have installed communal solar panels and water tanks, providing a lifeline when municipal services fail. The line between soldier and civilian, between peace and war, is dissolving. Everyone is exposed. When war targets infrastructure, the damage ripples outward, disrupting families, businesses, and whole cities far from any battle. Even if you live far from the conflict, your life depends on fragile, interconnected supply chains that can shatter overnight. In 2021, the global semiconductor shortage showed how a disruption in one region can stall factories thousands of miles away. A sobering reminder that no one is immune. Understanding these threats is essential. The risks go beyond discomfort. They threaten security, health, and survival. In a world where war can reach anyone, adapting is not a luxury. It is a necessity. Practical steps include keeping extra food and water on hand, learning basic first aid, and staying informed through multiple channels. Communities can organize regular drills, establish neighborhood watch groups, and create mutual aid networks to ensure that the vulnerable are not left behind. So, with the stakes rising, what lessons should you and your community draw from this new reality? The experience of Ukrainians today offers a stark warning. Resilience must be built before crisis strikes. Cities and towns worldwide should invest in backup energy systems, diversify supply chains, and train citizens in emergency response. Schools can incorporate disaster preparedness into their curricula, and businesses can develop continuity plans that account for prolonged disruptions. The next phase of the conflict will test not only armies, but the resilience of entire societies. As frontline tactics shift, the fate of millions hangs in the balance. In the coming months, we may see more cities adopt decentralized energy systems, more families create emergency stockpiles, and governments rethink what national security truly means. When war crosses every border, where do you stand? And are you ready for it to reach you? This is not a hypothetical question. From cyber attacks on power grids in the United States to terrorist strikes on commuter trains in Spain, the vulnerability of modern life is a global issue. The lessons of Ukraine may soon be relevant everywhere. Today, the front lines are not just distant lines on a map. They twist through the wires that light our homes, the rails that feed our cities, and the fragile routines that make daily life possible. Russia's unrelenting attacks on Ukraine's power grids, train lines, and training camps expose a new kind of warfare, one where the target is not only territory, but the very ability of a nation to endure. The fallout is immediate and deeply personal. Entire towns plunge into darkness, factories and groceries shutter, and the rhythm of daily life is broken. Each destroyed substation or crippled rail link chips away at a country's strength, militarily and civically, leaving citizens more vulnerable with every blow. In the city of Sumy, for instance, The loss of a key transformer station meant hospitals had to rely on dwindling fuel supplies to keep generators running, and newborns in incubators faced life-threatening risks. Yet this crisis is not contained by Ukraine's borders. As Western military support grows uncertain and supplies grow thin, new dangers ripple outward. An energy shock in one country can spark price surges, fuel shortages, or political unrest in another. In a world so interconnected, no one is truly untouched by the tremors of conflict. The oil crisis of 1973 showed how a conflict in one region can lead to long lines at gas stations and economic turmoil halfway around the world. So ask yourself, what if your city went dark for a day, a week, or longer? What backup exists for your food, your transport, your medicine? If war now targets the arteries of modern life, turning away from these lessons could leave you, and millions, exposed when the next shock, military or otherwise, strikes. In Houston, during Hurricane Harvey, thousands discovered the hard way that a few days without power or water can upend every aspect of daily existence. We often count the cost of war in soldiers lost and ground taken. But the real toll is also measured in unheated classrooms, powerless hospitals, and families forced apart by the breakdown of daily order. Today's front line may be as close as your own front door. In Kyiv, one family described how, after a night of shelling, they awoke to find their neighborhood bakery destroyed, the same bakery that had provided bread through generations of hardship. Lasting stability depends not just on distant peace talks, but on how communities strengthen their resilience before the next crisis hits. The warning is clear. Will we act now or wait until it is too late? In the end, the survival of a nation and its way of life may depend on choices made not just by leaders, but by neighbors helping neighbors, and by every individual preparing for a world where the next front line could be anywhere.